So my name is Tiana, and I am a second-year MSW student at the University of Washington, Tacoma, and I currently work in the Tumwater Children's Administration Office as a CFWS social worker. And I wanted to interview you today about racial disproportionality because since starting with the department, I've become very interested in the topic and what can I be doing better as a worker.
Oh, great. Nice to meet you, Tiana. I'm Kathy Taylor, and I did work for the department for over 25 years in various capacities. And before coming to the University of Washington, I was a statewide disproportionality program manager, but now I'm with the CTAP program at UW Seattle as the CTAP field advisor. So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
So I'm excited. So Tiana, tell me, why is discussing disproportionality important? Why do you think it's important?
I think for me specifically in my current position, one of the most important things that I'm trying to search for is the need for culturally competent services that I'm offering my families. And I think this also impacts how we're doing reports and investigations and what the outcome of those investigations are. And then also just how to deal with worker racial bias and discrimination that's present in child welfare currently.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
So for you, what are the most important things about racism and racial disproportionality in public child welfare I need to know as a new white child welfare social worker?
So I think one of the most important things is to realize that it's real. Racism is real. I think sometimes people think that it's not, that we use the saying of living in a post-racial society. We don't. It's very real, and that race matters when it comes to working with our children in the welfare system. So I think realizing how important it is for you as a social worker to be able to identify with that child, be able to identify with the culture, where they come from, be able to learn about their culture and them, the traditions of their family. I just think that that's vital when you're working with children of color. They're in our system at much higher rates than white children are. So if we're going to do anything about that, it's very important for you to keep that in mind. I think that sometimes people put disproportionality on the back burner when it really needs to be one of the priorities of your caseload. Those children of color need more attention oftentimes. When they come into the system, they stay longer. So there's barriers and there's issues that get in the way that have to be worked on that sometimes the white children do not face. So you have to be keeping that in the forefront of your mind and remembering that, keeping that thought that, that they do suffer in ways that white children do not.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good thought.
Yeah.
What about this work should I pay attention to and do differently than is currently being done to have more equitable service delivery and outcomes for families of color?
I think with our services, it's important to know that, of course, culturally competent services are what our families need. I think oftentimes we get services and we get the families involved with services, but to check in with that family, to see how that service is actually working for them. Is it working for them? Is it not working for them? Are they comfortable with that service provider? And I think looking into those service providers and checking them out, seeing if they have worked with families of color before, seeing what type of cultural competency experience that they have. I think we oftentimes just want to take at face value that our service providers are able to do all the work that we expect them to do culturally and appropriately, and that's not always the case. So I think always making sure that you're checking in with those families and making sure that they're getting what they need, and to really advocate for more services of people of color, if possible, using them and making sure that they're able to connect with the families. But questioning that service provider, kind of doing a little interview,
yeah.
And checking with about their experience. And just making sure that your family is making progress with that service provider. Because oftentimes they'll go through those services And we're not aware of whether that has really been effective or not, and making sure that we have a pulse on that.
Do you have examples of practice tips for dealing with racism and or implicit bias when it occurs in the field? So from systems, peers, families, and caregivers?
Yeah, I think the most important thing and most important tip to give is for you to know yourself. Realize and know that we all have biases, but being able to work through those biases, being able to recognize that the biases that we carry definitely have effect on the families and the children that we work with, the foster parents. So checking yourself in those biases and making sure that you're not allowing those biases to get in the way of you servicing the people that you're servicing. I think those judgments and assumptions that we have, that we've grown up with, we need to check them. Are they accurate? And if not, we need to make sure that we're not giving in to those assumptions, the stereotypes we hear, the biases, what society tells us about different groups of people, and oftentimes our own personal experiences with people of color. Being able to really look at that inwardly and see what is the work that I need to do to make sure that I'm not holding on to that bias as I work with these families, So educating yourself, going to workshops, going to trainings that challenge you around that issue, talking with people that can challenge you around that issue, talking with coworkers, so that we can cut down on the bias, because our families do suffer from that quite a bit. That's why we have disproportionality.
How do you recommend that I can educate and push people out of their comfort zone that I'm working with on a daily basis, so coworkers who might not be as aware of their own personal bias, but it's very present in the work field?
Mm-hmm. One of the things I think is important, again, is putting disproportionality out there in the front, making sure that you're having that conversation about disproportionality, about bias, about racism, making sure that that conversation stays on the table. Otherwise, people, they're not then challenged. And if you're not challenged, you're not going to grow. So I think challenging them, not being afraid to challenge them, but then you have to be comfortable enough to have that conversation. Can you have that conversation about race? Can you, when someone says anything inappropriate, when those microaggressions come out from social workers or even from foster parents or whoever you're working with, can you check that? Can you say, or can you challenge them and say that was not quite right, and be able to explain why? So taking those moments where you see microaggressions coming out or biases coming, being able to take that moment and use it as a teachable moment to inform. Because oftentimes people are not, often aware of that implicit bias that they carry. So taking and making yourself a teacher of one when you have that opportunity to do so.
So we have really high caseloads, and how do you recommend that I keep disproportionality as a priority when I have so many other priorities on a daily basis?
Well, I think when it comes to disproportionality, you have to be intentional about it. When you look at that caseload, you have to be intentional about working with those children of color and knowing that it might take a little extra effort. It might take a little bit more time, but in the long run, it saves you time, because if you can provide that attention, whether it's advocacy, whether it's even working with the family around different problems that they might be having, that if you can take the time to work with them and show more of a concerted effort, that it saves you time in the long run. I think that you have to reprioritize your priorities. So you have to put those cases with children of color out there in the forefront, looking at them on a regular basis, checking out and realizing what are the barriers, what can I do about these barriers, and making sure that you're addressing those barriers so that they don't linger on. Children stay in our system longer when they enter in. So in order to do work around that, know that it might take a little extra effort, but in the long run, it does help, because it helps to decrease, help to get children out of our system.
How do you think that Washington State is doing in addressing racial disproportionality in public child welfare?
I think that disproportionality within our state has been kind of a up and down with the support that it's gotten. There have been times when it's been well supported and other times when it hasn't. But the thing about disproportionality is that it's a nationwide problem. And when you look at how our work in the CFSR and how we measure the work that we do, and when we look at areas where we fall short, that is one of the areas where we fall short. So it's good to know that the strategic plan that they have in place addressing disproportionality, there are some measures in there that show that there are certain strategies that have to be worked on. So kids in care for 2 years or longer, children of color staying in the system longer, that's one of the things I know that has been on the forefront and that they've been working on. They also have a racial disproportionality committee that works with children's administration, that brings about issues that they think that also CA needs to work on. So that trickling down to the field, I think sometimes is difficult, it's hard, but making sure that those goals that are set, that the field is well aware of them and that those things can be worked on a consistent basis. So I think that we're trying to make some leeway, but we're far from where we should be.
Definitely. How can we help children of color in out-of-home care be immersed in their culture when they are in white homes with white providers? And do you feel that this is important?
It's very important because all children need to be able to grow up in an environment where they feel comfortable, where they feel at home. So I think that when you're placing children in white homes, I think our foster parents need training that if they're going to take children of color, they need to be willing to do the work with children of color. They need to be able to expose them to their culture. They need to be willing to learn about their culture. They need to be willing to do trainings or whatever it takes that they might learn how to best, serve those children. So I think that as the department, there's nothing wrong with us requiring that foster parents need to do that. As we have to place kids when unfortunately we don't have enough families of color that are doing foster parenting. So making sure that they can make that commitment for them to grow up with a healthy racial ethnic identity, that needs to happen. We need those families to be willing to assist in that area.
Aside from training foster parents, do you think it's the responsibility of the specific social worker to look at what they can be doing to help this child immerse themselves in culture and making that a priority when you're interacting with the child?
Yes, definitely. Giving them suggestions, connecting them to their community, being a resource for them. I think that's very important, yes. I think the worker makes a big difference, in what services and how we treat our children of color. It begins with the social worker.
Well, I think our time is coming to an end, but thank you so much for meeting with me and talking with me about this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tiana. I'm glad you're interested.
I'm very interested. Thank you.
Thank you.